Mustafa weighed options, negotiating terms for his return. Times were tense and the pressure built within Mustafa until it erupted with irrational fury. He could not vent his wrath in the political arena, so he chose as his victims those who were closest to him. The servant was 5 minutes late laying the food for iftari, the sunset meal that breaks the day's fast during the holy month of Ramadan. When he finally arrived, a hungry Mustafa exploded. In the presence of his mother, who lived with us, he thrashed the poor man until he was barely conscious. Then he sat back down at the dinner table and commanded, "Eat up." His mother began to eat, but I mumbled that I had lost my appetite. Mustafa turned a hate stare upon me and spouted obscenities. Quickly, I pecked at my food. For the next 4 hours, Mustafa's temper grew progressively worse. By the time we retired to our room, violence was thick in the air. In the dressing room, I donned my infamous Bo Peep frock, which served as a comfortable nightgown for my pregnant body. I walked toward the bed, but found Mustafa blocking my way, standing in the midst of the room, lit only by a crack of light emanating from the dressing room door. A chill ran up my spine. He instructed me to sit on the edge of the bed, and sat beside me. Then he began to interrogate me about my marriage to Aints. How had we met? Where I answered these simple queries, but then the questions became more intrusive. With each question his tone grew angrier, his breathing uneven. His eyes reddened. The skin of his face stretched taut with anger. And with each answer, my own heart beat faster. He wanted to know all the details of our wedding night. "Can't we forget it, Mustafa?" I requested softly. "It's all over. Must we talk about it now?" "I've asked you a question," he responded curtly. "Answer me." I was very scared, and I could only stammer. "You're hiding things from me," he charged. "There's more to it." "There isn't. I've told you everything before. I don't think we should discuss this now. It's upsetting you. Who the hell are you to think? I have asked you a question. Answer me." He grabbed my right wrist and twisted, forcing me to my knees. Even as a shriek escaped from my lips, I told myself to be quiet, lest the servants, or his mother, hear. He released his grip and I scrambled to my feet, gasping, rubbing my sore arm. He ordered me to sit down again on the bed, and the interrogation continued. He asked, "When you had sex with Aints, did you respond?" I whimpered. "I was only 18, I wasn't interested." "Liar," he raged. I could feel his body tighten, I could hear his breathing grow heavier. In the dark, I could sense that his eyes were bulging out of their sockets. I knew that his fists were clenched. With deliberate malice he asked, "If you did not want sex with Aints, how did Tanya come to be born?" The answer, whatever I chose to say, would condemn me, but I had no opportunity. Suddenly, he threw me down onto the bed and jumped on me. Sitting astride my belly, he slapped me in the face repeatedly with his open palm, forehand and backhand. The sounds of his blows seemed too loud to remain confined to the four walls of the room. I fought to stifle my screams as he pulled at my hair, thrusting my head from side to side. Like lightning, he leaped off me. One hand clutched my long, braided hair and jerked me off the bed and onto the floor. I felt a wetness run down my legs, but had no time to realize that my bladder lacked the strength to face this kind of fear. He threw me against wall, picked me up and threw me against another one again and again and again. I no longer knew what was happening. Something burst in my ears. I felt an agonizing pain in my eyes. Something split. Something swelled. Then the pain merged into one deep, enthralling sense of agony. I did not know how long the beating lasted. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. The intensity made it an eternity. Then, quite suddenly, it was over. His fury was sated. I begged in a weak voice, please, God. I need to go to the bathroom. He allowed me to stagger off. I leaned heavily against the sink top and struggled to catch my breath. Slowly I raised my eyes to the mirror. I gasped in fresh fright at the monster who gazed back at me. A shiver ran through me. My teeth chattered. My body shook. My braid had opened and my long hair was wild and strewn, like a witch's. The right side of my nose had disappeared, merging into a swollen cheek. My lips protruded in an exaggerated and grotesque pout. My eyes were deeply sunk into huge, purple patches. One of them hurt badly and was bloodshot. A piercing pain screamed in one ear. The left side of my scalp was matted with blood. I pulled at it and tufts of hair came out in my hands. I rinsed my mouth and tasted blood. Suddenly, I was terrified that I had remained too long in the bathroom. I stumbled back into the bedroom, shaken, drained and near collapse. My back ached severely. Mustafa sat on the bed with his head bowed and his palms placed over his temples. He looked up at me, shattered, transformed from a wild, vengeful beast into a meek and frightened little child. He fell at my feet and wept. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, he wailed. What have I done to you? He begged forgiveness. He said that he must have been possessed by an evil spirit. He had not meant to hurt me. He could not understand his actions, perhaps the jealousy over another man in my life was insufferable, because his love for me was fear. He threw me against wall, picked me up and threw me against another one again, and again, and again. I no longer knew what was happening. Something burst in my ears. I felt an agonizing pain in my eyes. Something split. Something swelled. Then the pain merged into one deep, enthralling sense of agony. I did not know how long the beating lasted. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. The intensity made it an eternity. Then, quite suddenly, it was over. His fury was sated. I begged in a weak voice, please, God. I need to go to the bathroom. He allowed me to stagger off. I leaned heavily against the sink top and struggled to catch my breath. Slowly I raised my eyes to the mirror. I gasped in fresh fright at the monster who gazed back at me. A shiver ran through me. My teeth chattered. My body shook. My braid had opened and my long hair was wild and strewn, like a witch's. The right side of my nose had disappeared, merging into a swollen cheek. My lips protruded in an exaggerated and grotesque pout. My eyes were deeply sunk into huge, purple patches. One of them hurt badly and was bloodshot. A piercing pain screamed in one ear. The left side of my scalp was matted with blood. I pulled at it and tufts of hair came out in my hands. I rinsed my mouth and tasted blood. Suddenly, I was terrified that I had remained too long in the bathroom. I stumbled back into the bedroom, shaken, drained and near collapse. My back ached severely. Mustafa sat on the bed with his head bowed and his palms placed over his temples. He looked up at me, shattered, transformed from a wild, vengeful beast into a meek and frightened little child. He fell at my feet and wept. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, he wailed. What have I done to you? He begged forgiveness. He said that he must have been possessed by an evil spirit. He had not meant to hurt me. He could not understand his actions, perhaps the jealousy over another man in my life was insufferable, because his love for me was overwhelming. He had no control over his behavior. He could not bear the idea of his wife with another man, even if it was a past husband. I was very confused by the unaccountable pity I felt for this man, who had his forehead on my feet, anointing them with his tears. I tried to forgive him, but the pain would not allow me to forget. All night long I twisted in agony. All night Mustafa sat up, doing his best to ease my discomfort. We both knew that I needed medical attention, and Mustafa was very nervous about arranging for it. It was obvious that I had been assaulted and cruelly battered, and he begged me to endure the pain in order to keep up appearances. The timing was critical, because he was scheduled to go to Islamabad to meet Bhutto, and was worried that the servants, or his mother, would see the extent of my injuries and talk. If this leaks out, people will not give our marriage a chance, he warned. Your position will be reduced to the lowly one that all my other wives had. I don't want you to be humiliated. Nobody should ever say that I dared or wished to lift my hand to you. I want people to respect you. If they thought that I didn't, why should they? He had touched the effective spot. My humiliation at his hands was relatively less than if I exposed it to others. I was mortified by the thought of publicity. Fear of the indignity made me cringe. I was conditioned to believe in the concept that image is the paramount thing. This was a personal and private matter between my husband and me. We would work it out. I wanted no one to know, least of all my mother. I'll stay in the room till you get back, I promised. Tell everyone I've gone with you. Mustafa was visibly relieved. Aisha was assigned to smuggle food into the room. She also applied poultices to my face to quell the swelling. Mustafa journeyed to Islamabad, where Bhutto appointed him as special assistant and chief political advisor, with cabinet rank, and sent him immediately to the Punjab to ease the tension. At a mammoth public rally in Rawalpindi, wearing his trademark Mao cap, and waving an open palm in an imitation of an imam's blessing, Mustafa told a spirited crowd that the opposition should realize that Bhutto and the People's Party were showing restraint. We shall retaliate. If pushed any further, he vowed. We can match fire with fire. If they are crying for our blood, we too will go for their throats. Once more Mustafa blessed them with the same palm that he had used to lacerate my face. The crowd roared in approval. The Lion of the Punjab was back. Meanwhile, I waited quietly in the bedroom for 4 days, pretending not to be there. The time I spent in hiding made me even more convinced that exposure of my husband's violence would reduce me to Sherry's position. Too many people were waiting to prove my mistake and mock my humiliation. My marriage would lose credibility, and mother would not think me significant. Mustafa was correct when he said, if they think I don't respect you, why should they? My insecurities and inadequacies paled the event, and I wanted it erased quickly. More than 2 weeks passed before we deemed it safe for me to journey out to see doctors. By then, my face was an approximation of the original. I visited an ear specialist, a physiotherapist, and an eye specialist, who told me that the burst capillary in my right eye would bother me for the rest of my life. The thin red latticework appears even now, whenever my eyes become tired. The psychological damage was worse. Now, whenever Mustafa came home, I shuddered in fright. His unpredictable word was law. It was not for me to reason. My love for the man had now turned into fear. I knew that anything that I might say or do could make him angry. Sometimes even a sullen look would send him into a rage. Who are you thinking of, a lover, ain'ts? He demanded. I was suspect, because I had betrayed a husband. My track record sentenced me repeatedly. I began to say my prayers under my breath constantly, to keep him cool, to soften his heart toward me, to make him love me. I was incapable of thinking of any other issue. Nothing else was significant. Mustafa told me one day that I was not allowed to read a newspaper. I obeyed without a squeak of protest. From then on, when he found me in a room that contained newspapers, I felt caught, and prayed that he would not think that I had actually attempted to read one of them. My prayers usually went unanswered. If he walked into the room and saw a paper, he was likely to ask, "Did you read a newspaper?" I would answer, trembling, "No." Invariably he raged, "Don't lie to me." Nothing further was said. His fists did the talking. There was not a day that Mustafa did not hit me for some reason. The food was late, his clothes were creased. With a shudder, I realized that I had become just like the now discarded Sherry. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was that, like her, I stopped questioning his violent outbursts. I just tried my best not to provoke him. If I dared to object in some meager way, the beating was only worse. At last I understood Sherry's dilemma. By the minute I became like her. He continued to use my first marriage as a stick to beat me with. My divorce and remarriage had proved to him that I was capable of adultery. This produced complete sexual confusion in me. I was afraid that my slightest response to his advances would reinforce his image of me as a common slut. This was a feudal hang-up. His class believed that a woman was an instrument of a man's carnal pleasure. If the woman ever indicated that she felt pleasure, she was a potential adulteress, not to be trusted. Mustafa did not even realize that he had crushed my sensuality. His attitudes were contradictory. He expected response, yet disallowed it. I was on automatic pilot, responding as much as was important for him, but never feeling anything myself. If he was satisfied, there was a chance that he would be in better humor. It was at these times that I realized that prostitution must be a most difficult profession. I could only develop in the direction that he chose. To think independently was a crime that he had the right to punish. Many of his beliefs ran counter to everything that I considered right, but there was no way that I could dare to engage him in a rational debate. His values were steeped in a medieval milieu, a mix of prejudices, superstitions, and old wives' tales. High on the list was the role of the wife. According to feudal tradition, a wife was honor-bound to live her life according to her husband's whims. A woman was like a man's land. The Quran says so, he said. This was a revealing simile. A feudal lord loves his land only in functional terms. He encloses it and protects it. If it is barren, he neglects it. Land is power, prestige and property. I interpreted the Quran differently. To me, land had to be tended and cultivated. Only then could it produce in abundance. Otherwise, it would be barren. But of course, I was expected to accept Mustafa's interpretation without question. Yet he was not completely backward. He was a feudal lord who had been exposed to the modern world, and his philosophies were eclectic. He kept me suppressed and cloistered, but then again he treated me as a companion. He discussed politics with me and expected me to take an active interest in his work. I was like a wall on which he could bounce off ideas, but I was expected to bounce them true, rather than attempt to deflect them in any way. He also allowed me to drink wine, but only in his presence and when he chose. In fact, he insisted upon it. It will make you relax, he would say. You are too tense in bed. But no matter how much I drank, I never allowed myself to forget in whose presence I was. I discovered that the human mind was strong enough to control the effects of alcohol in times of danger. I became incapable of thinking logically. Indeed, I was afraid to think, for irrationally, I was certain that he could penetrate my mind. He fed this fear frequently, by saying, "I know what you're thinking. Tehina, believe me. You daren't think of anything that I have forbidden you to think about." My brain was washed, bleached and hung out to dry. I was afraid to sleep, lest I dream images that would annoy him. Mother's words, based upon her interpretation of the Quran, rang in my memory. If I tell any of my children to jump from the roof, they must obey without hesitation or question. Only the schizophrenic quality of his behavior, and my own ambivalent reactions to him allowed me to survive. When he was in a sunny frame of mind, he was loving and considerate. He fed me with his own hands. He dreamt with me. He promised to be a good husband. I grasped desperately at these signs of his approval. My goal was to keep him in this mood. He was obsessed with my knee-length brown hair. He would not allow me to sit with my back to a fire, lest the hair suffer damage in his tenderest moments. He returned to this passion, oiling and combing my tresses. He made me promise that I would never cut my hair, or even trim the split ends. I knew that I could not leave him. I had entered into a controversial marriage, and I had to strive to keep it intact. I recognized that there was always an effort and a price to pay for success. I must not fail at any cost. A lasting and happy marriage was my only value. Under its respectable shroud, alongside my powerful husband, my mother would not be able to shun me, and the fear of that happening became equal to, or even greater than my fear of him. The two fears kept me shaken and traumatized. I did not have the confidence to walk away. I reasoned that Mustafa would hunt me down and find me, no matter how far I ran. Then he would murder me. I was convinced of it. By the time I was 8 months pregnant, Mustafa's rich, force-fed diet had caused me to balloon from my normal 8 stone to almost 11 stone. I looked and felt like a bloated cow. We moved to the State Bank house in Islamabad, so that Mustafa could be at Bhutto's side during what had become a deepening political crisis. We lived amid intrigue, and were forced to maintain strict security procedures. We were guarded by a live-in gunman named Matin. One of the men whom Mustafa frequently encountered at cabinet meetings was General Zia-ul-Haq, the army chief of staff. He was noted for his silence and apparent obsequiousness, and he seemed to hold Bhutto in awe. On the evening of the 4th of July, 1977, my grandmother and I were waiting for Mustafa at a restaurant, where he was to meet us after a cabinet meeting. When he finally arrived, he was both very late and very disturbed. I asked what troubled him. Anxiously he reported, "General Zia suddenly seems to have opinions of his own." The man was disagreeing with some of the plans we were putting forward. His attitude change means that he is being manipulated by bigger powers. I warned Mr. Bhutto something's brewing. That night, at 3 a.m., Matin rushed into our bedroom. Instantly alert, Mustafa reached for his rifle. Matin indicated with his hand that Mustafa should follow him. I was only vaguely aware of this, and drifted back to sleep. 10 minutes later, I was reawakened by a loud banging on the front door. Tired and sleepy, I stumbled out of the bedroom and encountered Matin, who told me in an urgent tone to go back inside. I retreated, but left the door slightly ajar, and peeped through the crack. Within moments, I was startled to see 2 uniformed men walk past stiffly. 5 soldiers followed, with the Sten guns at the ready. One took up a position in the corridor, and noticed that the bedroom door was ajar, that a light was on. He turned quickly and kicked the door into my protruding belly. I winced in pain. The infant in my womb kicked back. I banged the door shut, and sat on the bed, trying to figure out what was happening. Had the army come to arrest Mustafa? Had Mustafa annoyed Bhutto again? Or was this a coup? Initiated the proverbial midnight knock on the door. Was this drama being played out in houses across the length and breadth of the country? The clock on the bedside table ticked loudly. Half an hour passed. Finally Mustafa returned to the bedroom. He was calm, and I could almost see his mind working out permutations, analyzing, trying to plan. He told me that the army had moved against Bhutto, martial law was declared. He ordered me to pack his suitcase and added, "Don't forget my vitamins and my cigars." "Is it going to be dangerous?" I asked. "I don't know. It might be a bloody coup. They've come to get me. You'd better go to Ghulam Arbi and Saima's house today." Arbi was his brother. "Don't worry," Mustafa said. I packed his things. He kissed me on the forehead and left. I stared out of the window. In the darkness, I could make out a jeep filled with army officers. Mustafa got in and the jeep sped off. At Arbi and Saima's house, I listened carefully as General Zia gave a televised speech. He had assumed power, but he promised to hold elections within 90 days. He said that the politicians were being held in protective custody, but would be freed soon. For 15 days I knew nothing of Mustafa's whereabouts. Then he was able to send me a note. He was well. He was in Abbottabad, north of the capital. 3 weeks before my baby was due, Mustafa and other political prisoner were moved a short distance to detention facilities in one of the state guest houses in Murree, the mountain resort, where I had studied, and I was allowed to visit him there. I remembered how different my father's imprisonment had been. There was no shame in political incarceration, and yet I was conditioned by mother's behavior in her situation to be naturally in a state of mourning, a good wife whose life had come to a standstill because her husband was in trouble. My conditioning suited Mustafa. I shopped carefully and brought along a great deal of food, concerned for the welfare of my poor, suffering husband. To my shock, I found Mustafa and the others living in conditions that would be the envy of the common man. The prisoners decided the menu and the food was served by uniformed waiters. The politicians who, only weeks before, had shuffled the fate of our nation, now sat around all day shuffling cards. Only the sound of marching boots outside their quarters shattered the illusion of tranquility. I shifted temporarily to Murree, spending the days with Mustafa and the nights at his friend Taj ul Mulk's home. Even in incarceration, within the Prime Minister's house in Murree, Bhutto held court. Each day his imprisoned advisors were driven in a van to see him. Over dinner they discussed the current situation. Bhutto was furious with Zia and, even now, arrogant. He charged that the generals had violated the constitution. Article 6 outlawed military intervention and martial law. He openly abused the generals and accused them of treason. He swore that he would make them accountable. Mustafa and others gently warned him against such reckless statements, but Bhutto persisted. Bhutto clung to legalisms, ignoring the fact that the generals had the guns. At times, he mellowed and spoke of the future, of how the next 5 years were imperative for him to consolidate and implement the reforms that he had begun, and that would grant him an exalted place in history. He felt shortchanged by the generals, a man of destiny locked out of his own future. He believed that the VIP treatment that he and the other People's Party captives were receiving was a tacit acknowledgement that Zia still needed them. These conversations were most certainly taped, and as the generals listened to them, their determination to rid themselves of Bhutto must have grown. I could sense that the time of my delivery was at hand. I visited a doctor in Murree, and was astonished when she told me that the civil and military hospital in the city did not have the facilities to deliver my child. I had no choice but to return to Arbi's house in Islamabad and wait for the labor pains to begin. 3 days later a huge, black limousine with military license plates arrived. We were all shocked to see Mustafa emerge. Smiling Zia had allowed him special permission to visit his pregnant wife. He spent the night with me and left early the following morning in the dictator's car. This aroused that suspicion in the minds of Bhutto and Mustafa's fellow inmates that Mustafa had struck a deal behind their backs. The generals fanned the suspicion by holding Mustafa in Rawalpindi for the next few days. Mustafa had requested the meeting with me in all innocence, but he was now suspect and became somewhat isolated from his allies. 2 days later Zia released Bhutto and all the political leaders. Bhutto flew back to Islamabad in a helicopter, and Mustafa was returned to us. And a few days after this, on the 29th of July, I gave birth to our daughter Nasiba. She slept in our bed with us. Mustafa instructed Dai Aisha to fashion a semicircular enclosure of clay to hold the baby's head as she slept. This was a medieval custom that he said would make the shape of her head flat and beautiful. I shuddered as I saw the contraption take shape. Finally the trap was ready and Nasiba's tiny head was placed inside it. She was very uncomfortable in this strange, restrictive device. Her head directly faced the ceiling. She could not move it at all, and wailed all night long. She grew purple with agitation. I feared that she would choke and desperately wanted to put her on her tummy, but this was not allowed. Her bawling disturbed Mustafa, and he ordered me to quieten her, but he would not allow me to remove her from the head trap. I was very frightened. Servants had told me stories about his behavior toward Sherry's daughter, Amma. If the poor baby howled as he tried to sleep, Mustafa picked her up and shoved her under the bed. On a number of occasions, Mustafa stifled Nasiba's yells with his hand, or with a cloth. He reacted so fiercely that I feared he would suffocate her. My beautiful baby girl, instead of being a source of joy, became a cause of new, frightful tension. Now I had 2 of us to protect. But at least the arrival of the baby tempered my mother's mood. She flew in from London to stay with us for a time, and especially in the context of her previous disapproval, I sought to hide the brutality of my marriage from her. I knew that mother would approve of my life only if we were happy. Mother was invited to a ladies' dinner, and she wanted me and 2-week-old Nasiba to accompany her. Mustafa reluctantly granted his permission, to avoid drawing my mother's attention to his true nature. But he was irritable and said that it was the last time he would permit such a thing. He set a firm curfew of 10:30 p.m. and ordered me to handle the situation on my own next time, without involving him. Here was a form of mental torture. He pinned me against my strong-willed mother, but disarmed me by removing the weapon of truth. It was left to me to create the proper lie that would enable me to meet Mustafa's arbitrary curfew. I spent much of the evening nervously glancing at the clock. As is common in Pakistan, it was 10:30 before dinner was even served. We had only begun to eat when I was called to the telephone. Mustafa growled, "If you are not home in the next 5 minutes, I'll fix you." I returned to the dinner table. Terrified, I repeatedly hinted to mother that I had to leave, but she was involved in conversation and waved aside my protests. We finally arrived home at around midnight. Mother went into her bedroom, still unaware of my tense condition. Clutching Nasiba protectively to my bosom, praying to God for his help and mercy, I rushed into the bedroom. I wanted to get to him quickly, and yet I did not. Mustafa stood in the dark, waiting for us. He snatched the baby from my arms, put her onto the bed, and slapped me so hard that I fell. I suppressed my cries, so that nothing would carry to mother's adjacent room. I allowed myself a muted whimper. "Mother will hear." "Come upstairs," he ordered menacingly. By now, Nasiba was howling. I picked her up and ran quickly out of the door and up the stairs to another room, a torture chamber, as Mustafa followed. I knew what would happen, but my primary concern was that my mother not know my reality. He locked the door behind him. Again he plucked Nasiba from my arms and cast her aside. To the accompaniment of the continuous yells of a bewildered baby, he tore my sari to shreds and beat me savagely, avoiding my fate. Next morning I faced my mother as if nothing had happened. I was learning to hide my feelings and my bruises from the world. Bhutto decided to take his case to the people. He arrived in Lahore driven from the airport by Mustafa and was greeted by a vibrant crowd. In his waning days as Prime Minister, the people had grown tired of his promises of bread, clothing and shelter, but now he was the underdog and they wished to forget his mistakes. Bhutto was elated. The motorcade moved at a snail's pace toward the house where Bhutto would stay. Once he was inside, the crowd, trying to get closer, surged out of control. The pressure of people broke down the gates of the house. Excited spectators shattered the windows, climbed the walls, crowded onto the lawns, nested in the treetops, and clung precariously to utility poles. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the man. Everyone wanted to hear the stifled voice rise again. Bhutto stepped out onto the balcony, remarking that he felt as tall as the Himalayas, and delivered a rousing speech. General Zia has committed treason. He has tampered with the constitution. The people of Pakistan will not spare the traitor. The army does not have the right to usurp power by ousting the people's representatives and deposing an elected prime minister. The listeners responded with wild cheers. In their enthusiasm, they did we realize that they were signing Bhutto's death warrant. The scene shifted to Islamabad. In a calmer moment, Mustafa warned Bhutto that he must change his hard-line stance, or the generals would eliminate him. Bhutto was aloof and cold in the face of this advice. He felt that his confrontational policies would unnerve the generals and believed that the people would stand up to save their leader. He forgot that tanks and guns were more palpable than the mood of the people. Mustafa informed Bhutto that the generals wished to have a meeting with him, and Bhutto agreed that Mustafa should attend, since this would give him an opportunity to assess the military's thinking. During Mustafa's discussion with Zia and two of his compatriots, the three military leaders heaped praise and proclaimed that they needed people like him. But they were hostile toward Bhutto and declared that he could survive only if he tempered his arrogance. The generals said that they were not opposed to the idea of Bhutto going into exile, if he would guarantee that he was retiring from politics forever. This, Mustafa though, was like asking a human being to live without oxygen. When he reported back to Bhutto, Mustafa tried to convince his leader to flee the country, and asked permission to do so himself, to live to fight another day. Bhutto granted the latter request, and paved the way. He invited the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates and introduced him to Mustafa. He then wrote a note to Sheikh Zayed bin Nahyan, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, presenting Mustafa as my brother, and asking him to provide all necessary assistance. As for himself, Bhutto proclaimed that he understood the gravity of the situation, but he had no choice other than to stay and fight. Soon after this meeting, in September, Bhutto was rearrested on a charge of attempted murder, and witch hunt rounded up his key supporters. Mustafa was called into secret sessions with several generals. On night he informed me that we had to leave for England immediately, before dawn, without Nasiba. He said, would be too inconvenient and dangerous to bring her along. Shattered at the prospect of leaving behind another baby, even for a day, I was panic-stricken at given instructions for her routine, but it had to be. My pining meant nothing to anyone at this serious, difficult time, least of all to Mustafa. I suffered alone, just as I had suffered for Tanya. I did not know what sort of understanding Mustafa had achieved with the generals. I smelled betrayal, but I did not dare voice my suspicions. Mustafa sensed this and lectured that, in politics, compromises are necessary. We boarded at 6:30 a.m., in flight from Islamabad. As the aircraft waited for clearance at the end of the runway, I saw beads of perspiration form on Mustafa's brow. The veins in his temples pounded. There was fear on his face. We both knew that the generals were capricious. Finally, the aircraft moved slowly into its takeoff roll. The pilots pushed the engines to full throttle and the craft picked up speed. It rose into the air, and Mustafa's face showed relief. He had sidestepped the gallows. We had no definite plans. All we knew was that we would first stop in Mecca to perform the pilgrimage of Umrah, then head on to London. We had only 50,000 rupees, just over £1,100, with us, which would exchange to a pittance of British sterling. Immediately, I was lonely. I had lost both my babies. I glanced out of the window and saw our country fall sway beneath us. Part 2. Law of the Jungle. In Mecca, Mustafa placed his hand on the Kaaba, the house of Allah, and swore that he would never look at another woman in his entire life. For a Muslim, there is no greater testament. As we flew on to London, Mustafa was recognized by a Pakistani immigrant who was anglicized enough to call himself Harry. The two men passed the 6-hour flight in philosophical conversation, and by the time we landed, Harry had converted to our political cause and was our friend. There were no problems passing through immigration. Mustafa's political affiliations with Bhutto and his position caused no problem at all. We were granted political asylum. Harry offered us hospitality, and Mustafa accepted. Harry lived in a small, uncomfortable council flat in Earl's Court. Mustafa adapted easily to the crowded conditions. He was in exile, and exile meant sacrifice and discomfort. But I lay awake most of the first night, embarrassed that we had run away, leaving Bhutto in what was certainly his death cell. I did not know how Mustafa had arranged passage out of the country, but something told me that he had bartered his honor for his life. I resolved that if I was ever confronted with a similar situation, I would stand and fight on my own soil. Finally, I fell asleep and dreamed of revolution and marching. I held my head high as I stood on the gallows, and I did not flinch as the noose tightened around my neck. I pined for Tanya and Nasiba. There was no other equivalent pain. Tanya and Nasiba merged into one deep agony. Every time I saw an infant on the street, or in a pram in the park, my maternal ache was stirred, as though they might replace it, but I sensed that Mustafa viewed this as weakness. He did not tell me the details of the bargain he had struck with the generals, but by picking up shreds of information and overhearing telephone conversations, it was not difficult to discern. He had won his life by promising to return to Pakistan the following month, November, bringing documents from London that would incriminate Bhutto. What documents they were supposed to be I never discovered, and it was most probably a hoax. Though I did not know so at the time, I could not understand the Brutus-like betrayal. When his leader was fighting for his life against an unscrupulous regime, Mustafa conspired with the executioners. I expressed my qualms to him, but he replied in a philosophical tone, "Time will tell." He spent the first few weeks in London contacting other exiles, making his presence felt. He was in his element, making and breaking alliances, plotting, scheming, persuading the skeptical. In exile, a political activist quickly develops an inflated opinion of his importance, and Mustafa came to believe that he was the man who could unite the expatriates in a victorious struggle to overthrow Zia and his cronies. Mustafa saw his great chance to remold the People's Party under his influence. Nevertheless, he knew that it would be difficult to unite Bhutto's fanatical admirers behind him. He was contaminated by his own past. Mustafa had helped to found the party, but then he had abandoned it. True, he had rejoined, but his vacillation made him suspect in the eyes of the hardliners. They remembered how he had tried to humble Bhutto. They thought that he was too ambitious. Many also doubted his integrity, because of the manner in which he had left Pakistan. The party in exile was paranoid and informants were everywhere. As the deadline for the delivery of the documents approached, I sensed Mustafa's restlessness. If he did not comply as promised, he would raise the unforgiving ire of the generals and could not return to Pakistan. Mustafa decided to prove his loyalty to Bhutto and the party by reneging on his agreement with the generals, and I heartily approved. I declared that it was better to live on the run and in poverty than to return home to play Judas. I was very comfortable with this decision. He called one of the generals in Pakistan. In a nervous conversation, he managed to extend the deadline, buying an additional 2 months to test the strength of his support among the exile community. My family was living in London, and I talked to my mother on the telephone frequently. But my father adamantly refused to accept the scandalous Mustafa into his family. Mother and father currently had their own problems in the form of my sister, Manu, who had just turned 18. In England, this fact emancipated her. One day Manu called and said, "I have to see you urgently." We arranged a rendezvous at a restaurant. Manu told Mustafa and me that she wanted desperately to study photography at a boarding school on the Isle of Wight. The problem was that it was a coeducational institution, and my parents could not conceive of such an environment for their daughter. But the more they refused, the more adamant Manu became. She disclosed to us that she planned to run away. We tried to dissuade her, but she would not accept our counsel. Mustafa advised me, "Don't get involved." The following day, Mother called me, supremely upset. "Manu has run away," she wailed. Mustafa took the phone from my hand and spoke directly to Mother. "No matter what happens, I'll get Manu back," he promised. With that one vow, Mustafa built a special relationship with my mother. His voice carried the power and authority that father could never summon. Without really knowing my family, Mustafa had assumed the mantle of the big brother. Mother was immediately relieved. Before Manu had taken her desperate action, Mother had planned for the family to journey to its continental retreat in Marbella, Spain. Mustafa told her to go, and pledged to bring Manu to her there. Manu called us, as we knew she would, and Mustafa employed his powers of persuasion to convince her that she could get what she wanted without severing her family ties. His key argument was financial. Without money, how was Manu going to live, let alone go to school on the Isle of Wight? Come to Spain with us, he said, we'll sort it all out there. The three of us flew into Malaga. I rented a car, drove to Marbella and checked into the Holiday Inn. Soon after our arrival, Manu phoned Mother and attempted to begin the process of reconciliation. Mother snapped, "You can't ever leave again." Manu responded by screaming her frustrations into the phone, but Mustafa yanked it from her hand and said sternly, "You cannot dare to be rude to your mother in my presence." He lowered his voice and spoke into the mouthpiece, "We'll call later, I have to talk to her." He hung up and turned to my sister. From the expression on Manu's face, I could see that she realized that she was trapped. The small motel room suddenly seemed claustrophobic. Manu bolted for the door, but Mustafa grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. He held one strong hand against her throat, choking her. I attempted to pull him off, but was pushed aside by his free hand. Manu struggled briefly, then realized the hopelessness of her predicament and became subdued. Mustafa released his grip. He sat on the edge of the bed and allowed Manu to catch her breath. Then he lectured calmly, in a gentle, caring tone, "If you're going to react like this, they'll never let you go," he advised. "You have to play another game. Don't shout them." Too stunned to speak, Manu sat on the bed, suddenly docile and acquiescent. Her eyes told me that she realized that she was surrounded by enemies. She had to wait to fight another day. While Manu was in the bathroom, Mustafa phoned Mother and told her that Manu's only problem was she was spoiled. She needed control and discipline. Mother cried about the difficulties of bringing up young girls in the permissive environment of England. "Our active family," she said, "we don't know." By now, Mother had convinced my father that it was to accept us back into the family fold. In her brief dealings with Mustafa, she had found him to be an honorable man, and it was a time of adversity for him. She felt it inappropriate to continue the boycott. She invited us all to a reconciliation dinner and sent a car to drive us to their villa overlooking the sea. Father met me amidst tears and affectionate hugs. He was cordial to Mustafa. Obviously, Mustafa's strong hand with Manu had gained him favor. I was glad that our isolation was over. I respected my father's principles, as quietly proud that he had stood by them in spite anguish of our separation. It had caused us both pain, however, for I knew that I was his favorite. And I knew that he was ready to accept our marriage, convinced that whatever other faults Mustafa might, he was a family loyalist. Manu was on her best behavior, feigning cheers. Our younger sisters were also there. 15-year-old Zarmina, an aspiring clothes designer, had outfitted herself like a señorita, in a frilly Spanish dress, set off by a rose in her hair. Adila, the youngest, was 13. She wore black jeans and a t-shirt, and seemed very curious about us. I sensed that she admired my rebellion in standing up to our dictatorial mother, and running off to marry this famous man, with a notorious past. As soon as he could speak to me alone, Father outlined his manifesto. "I'm making up with you today despite the fact that I'm hurt and upset by your decision. This is your second marriage, and I don't want you, for any reason at all, to leave him. You can only leave his home in a coffin. This is the point on which I take you back into the family." Over dinner, Manu chatted non-stop. Zarmina was very affectionate and caring. But I felt something strange between Adila and Mustafa. There was a sense of presentiment in the air. As if two minds, who had never encountered one another, had established a silent bond. I tried to shake off the apprehension caused by the familiar glittery glaze in Mustafa's eyes. We remained in Marbella for 2 weeks, and during that time my father made the arrangements to cement my happiness by sending for Nasiba. Aisha traveled from Pakistan with my baby, and I felt nearly complete once more. Nasiba's 3 young aunts were captivated by the tiny bundle, and my father was a proud progenitor. Mother and Mustafa got along well, and I found, to my surprise, that she and I enjoyed one another, too. The only void was the absence of Tanya, a topic that I dared not discuss with Mustafa. I filled the emptiness by becoming obsessed with 5-month-old Nasiba. I fussed with her constantly and found myself lying awake at night, meticulously planning her breakfast. My parents maintained both a home and an apartment in London. Happy with the reconciliation, they offered to let us live in the apartment, and we accepted the invitation immediately. Marble Arch was much more comfortable and stylish than our first lodgings with Harry in Earl's Court. We returned to London with Zarmina and Adila. Manu was to be accompanied by my parents. Mustafa and I assumed a new life as fashionable exiles. We invited some old friends from Pakistan for dinner. I wanted to borrow Mother's silver, so Zarmina and Adila brought it over and stayed to help us prepare. As I arranged the apartment, Mustafa cooked, Zarmina fussed over the baby, and Adila attacked the liquor. By the time Zarmina and I noticed, our baby sister was floating in an alcoholic haze. She sashayed about the living room in an unsteady attempt to be provocative. Zarmina and I tried to pull her into the bedroom, but pushed us away. I worried that the guests would arrive and see her in this condition, and I worried even more that my parents would hear about this. I found Mustafa in the kitchen and said, "You have to do something. Give her hell and get her to leave." Mustafa moved toward Adila, unsure of himself. He grasped her by the shoulders and she struggled. But she struggled closer, rather than away. For a brief instant they stopped, almost sharing an embrace. Then Adila relaxed and suddenly agreed to go home. Zarmina and I knew that if our parents learned of this incident, they would brand me as a bad influence and keep us apart. So we conspired to keep the secret. Meanwhile, the Manu situation deteriorated. My parents, unable to emulate Mustafa's heavy-handed style, attempted to purchase her compliance. They brought her an expensive car, filled with luxurious accessories. "This is the wrong way to deal with her," Mustafa said to me. "They're giving in to her under pressure. She's winner." He suggested that they ship Manu back to Pakistan and take away her passport. Indeed, Manu once more ran away from home. No one knew of her whereabouts until a week later. Mother called and informed us tearfully that Manu was working in a record store on Tottenham Court Road. Mother considered this to be a rather sleazy area of Don, and I suppose that it was, although the depths of its degradation could not approach Mother's dark fantasies. In the midst of this latest crisis, we moved into my parents' home at Beach Hill, in order to be close to the family. The house was set in 2 acres overlooking a golf course. It was richly decorated with old Moroccan sofas, heavily carved pieces of furniture from Damascus, and chairs from King Farouk's palace collection. My mother's display of Persian carpets and paintings made this huge house a perfect setting for her to glide through like a queen. The family had a cook, 2 maids, a chauffeur, an accountant and a butler to attend to every need. Mustafa resented the opulence, yet he relished it. My family's style seemed to come naturally. They unknowingly mocked his country origins, just by being themselves. Mustafa chose to behave with inverted snobbery. He wore boorishness and earthiness like a t-shirt slogan. Father played the perfect host, offering Davidoff cigars at the appropriate moment, but he remained formal. Mother, on the other hand, was captured rather quickly by Mustafa's personality. She was very interested in politics, and listened with rapt attention as he regaled her with vignettes. He analyzed Pakistan's fluid political situation with great insight. Gradually, even father warmed somewhat. Mustafa was, after all, a member of their generation, a contemporary. At first I found irony in this situation. I had escaped from the domination of my mother by climbing into the lap of a tyrant, and it was somewhat amusing to see the two dictators magnifying one another's egos. But slowly I began to feel isolated. Mustafa became a part of the family from which I had tried to stand apart. Mustafa watched the dynamics within my family with a keen and manipulative eye. He correctly identified the Achilles heel. Father and especially mother would do anything, sacrifice anything, to save face. For example, the potential scandal regarding Manu was too much for my parents. They capitulated, rented a flat for her on the Isle of Wight, furnished it and allowed her to enroll in photographer's school. Mother made Manu promise to come home nearly every weekend and on every holiday, but it was clear that Manu had won. As January approached, Mustafa was afflicted with the common ailment of the exile, chronic optimism. He told me that General Zia's days were numbered. He won't last more than 6 months, Mustafa predicted. You'll see. He acted upon this optimism, informing the generals in Pakistan that he would not honor his agreement to return with documents incriminating Bhutto. For his troubles, he was sentenced in absentia to 14 years of rigorous imprisonment, and all his assets were confiscated. Personal injury was added to political insult when Mustafa's mother was denied a passport. We had hoped to bring her to London to join us, but the authorities in Pakistan obviously believed that they could use her as bait to lure Mustafa back. He was very attached to his mother, and this action crushed him. He sat quietly in his chair, with tears in his eyes, as he contemplated this latest twist. Mustafa's malaise was only temporary. Soon he began a long-distance campaign to save Bhutto, even as, at home, the trial of the former Prime Minister began. Our fights were now centered around my family. Mustafa picked up on tiny snippets of dinner-table conversation and used them against me. In vulnerable moments, I had made the mistake of selling him of the difficult childhood relationship I had had with my mother, and he turned this information against me. He was on her side now, and cast me in the role of an ungrateful, untrustworthy child. He methodically widened the gulf between mother and daughter, isolating me even more completely on the island of his tyrannical rule. At other times he suddenly posed as my ally. He would say, "I think I will discuss with your mother you misgivings about your relationship. All these things you have told me must come out. She must be made aware of the pain that has been caused to you." He knew that I would panic. I lacked the strength to take on both Mustafa and my mother. I pleaded with him not to follow through with his plan, and I submitted even more willingly to his cruel whims in order to buy his silence. Each morning Mustafa woke early and did his yoga. Then he sat in my parents' bedroom, drinking coffee and discussing the latest news from Pakistan. Mother and father were, or at least pretended to be, unaware that this charming person had, the night before, battered their daughter. I camouflaged my bruises and buried my humiliation. I started taking Valium to calm my nerves. My father wondered why, and objected, but my mother agreed that I needed the tranquilizer to relieve my tension. I suspected that she knew the cause, but she believed ruthlessly in keeping one's private life locked away. The most she would do was speak in general terms. She advised me, if a husband behaves in a strange or unreasonable manner, you should treat him like a sick human being, like someone who needs medical care and treatment. Deal with him like a psychiatrist. I took this counsel to heart, and it helped. My body suffered, but my mind was spared. I wanted desperately to shed the uncomfortable and unattractive pounds that I had retained after Nasiba's birth. Mustafa would not allow talk of a diet or other weight loss strategies, so I secretly obtained a supply of diet pills. I lost most of the extra weight, but I still felt matronly. Often I looked with envy at the women in England, moving about, laughing, participating in life. Although we had traveled extensively, and were now living in this free society, in my mind I might, as well have been sequestered behind the veil in Mustafa's village of Cottadoo. Mustafa felt increasingly isolated too. I was quite amazed to realize that I understood his predicament and wanted to help him deal with it. My tired mind at times was to analyze and rationalize. I could empathize with his frustration. He missed having a bevy of disciples. He missed being chief. He disliked being in a foreign country. He missed the panoply of power. I reached out to him and tried to build his morale. I learned to forgive him his temper and abusive nature. I subconsciously submitted to the role of whipping boy and allowed the man, who had once run a province, with an iron hand to rule me instead. His hand never once trembled. Fortunately, Nasiba was safely out of the way, almost always in the care of my sisters, who became the proverbial fussy aunts. This, at least, meant that I had one less person to protect from this abnormal man living in abnormal circumstances. I was always acting, petrified that the truth of my marriage would be exposed. I tried my utmost to avoid any clash with Mustafa. He realized my paranoia and exploited it fully. He forbade me to talk to anyone about my secret torment, with threats of severe consequences, but this was unnecessary since I felt as ill could trust no one. It was a schizophrenic existence. The humiliation of not being able to keep my husband happy, and of falling short of my mother's definition of the ideal wife, was becoming more frightening than the beatings. The physical abuse was not his crime, it simply affirmed my own inadequacy. Mustafa never allowed me to go out alone. Mother frequently asked me to accompany her to lunch, or to a doctor's appointment, or merely to go shopping. And I always had to come up with a plausible excuse. I was forbidden even to ask Mustafa's permission, I was to handle it on my own. Mother saw my refusals selfishness. I longed to tell her the real reasons, but forced myself into a tortured silence. Despite all the problems I had with my mother, I felt an overpowering urge to become her child again. She symbolized strength. I saw her as the only force could countervail Mustafa's evil. Whenever he hurt me I cried out for Bet, and prayed that she would come and save me. I longed to describe to her in detail what was happening to me, but I was sure she would react by taking his side, that she would find some way to trivialize my torment and reject me. By a process of elimination, I attempted to learn how to mold my personality, so that Mustafa and I could live in harmony. I tried to emulate whatever attitudes I knew that he had appreciated in his previous wives, but nothing seemed to alter his savage behavior. At times I even found myself perversely thankful for the beatings, because they would be followed by his groveling remorse. To see this man, larger than life, reduced to such a degrading position, brought a twisted measure of glee. When he surrendered to a tender moment, he praised my fortitude. Do you know how much you mean to me? I am incomplete without you. This has been a very frustrating period in my life. It will pass. You'll see, I'll change and make it up to you. I've been so close to a nervous breakdown. It has only been your love and devotion that has kept me sane. His eyes would well with tears as he continued, you came into my life at a most difficult period. Everything around me has crumbled, but you've stood by me. I wish you had come into my life earlier, so that I could keep you wrapped up in silks. I've put you through hell. I'm really sorry. Can you ever forgive me? He cried at my feet. He confessed that he had tried to destroy me and was amazed at my tolerance and resilience. I never thought you could cope with my temper, he admitted. I always thought you were too delicate and fragile. You proved me wrong. You're a strong woman. You're the only woman who has the tolerance to cope with MC intelligently. I will never, ever let you down. Promise me that you'll never think of abandoning me. I promised, washed ashore on his tears, proud of his high esteem for me, hoping that he would tell Mother. Sitting on my prayer mat, I regularly asked for deliverance. I did not ask God to resolve my crisis in any specific way. I merely asked him to help sort out my life, and to change Mustafa for the better, and to lessen the punishment for my mistakes. Adila stood 5 feet, 4 inches tall, and had the figure of a siren. She craved attention. My other sisters kept their distance from Mustafa, and, when they were together, were very correct in their behavior. But Adila was younger and wilder. She seemed to sense that she and her brother-in-law were soulmates. Mustafa indulged her spoiled whims and laughed at her childish pranks. Initially, it was quite touching to see Mustafa remove his dictatorial mask and play Big Brother. We ascribed Adila's coquettishness to juvenile cockiness. My parents left for a 15-day trip to the Middle East, and Adila went with them. Mustafa remained irritable and restless during this period, and turned the smallest issue into a terrible fight. With the house to ourselves, he knew that he could thrash me with impunity. Once, he grew very upset as I talked to my brother Asim on the phone. Why did you speak to him for so long? He growled. Is he your brother or your lover? I glanced up at him, amazed, and responded, he's my brother, Mustafa. Really? Are you answering me back? He used this so-called impudence as an excuse to pummel me with his fists. On another occasion, he kicked me down a staircase. When I landed at the bottom in a mangled heap, he ran down the stairs and resumed his savage kicks and blows. I cried. This is my father's house, and I do not think that you should dare to lift your hand on me here. This brought a stunned silence. For the first time, I had said what I felt, and I had scored a key point. I was not his chattel, but had other ties that were stronger than the ones that bound me to him. This realization brought only a moment's respite. A feudal lord understands the strength of blood ties, but he also understands the power of physical violence. Mustafa beat me with increased venom, until my screams weakened to tired whimpers and I was nearly unconscious. Later, in order to avoid yet another beating, I apologized for what I had said. I knew that my comment had shaken Mustafa, and he now had to plan some way to crush the tiny flicker of my remaining spirit. There was a brief hiatus when my parents and Adila returned. Then Mother and Father traveled to Luxembourg for 2 days, and left Adila at home with us. She nagged me to allow her to skip a day of school. When I grew weary of her pestering, I agreed, and she made plans for a shopping and luncheon expedition. But on the evening prior to the outing, she said that she had changed her mind and wanted to go to school after all. In the morning, our driver Eric, perhaps confused by the change of plans, did not show up to take her to school. Mustafa was going into the city anyway, so I asked him to drop her off at school. As they drove away, I waved and turned my attention to Nasiba. I thought nothing more of this until the middle of the afternoon, when Adila called to report, I bunked school today. I've gone to a friend's place. She chattered on about only missing a half day of classes and said that she would go to school for the rest of the afternoon. Can you send Eric to pick me up later? She asked. It was all very confusing, but I let the incident pass. I looked forward to my parents' return, so that they could resume their duties with her. Dealing with my youngest sister was a 24-hour-a-day job. Adila changed her manner of dressing. Suddenly, all Western outfits were discarded and replaced with traditional Eastern clothes, borrowed from our mother's extensive wardrobe. She draped herself with a veil and even covered her head for effect. She decided to grow her hair long like mine, and in fact began to resemble me. She ferreted out the sensitive topics in our lives, and wandered brazenly into them. In an innocent tone, she would mention how much I had longed to marry Ains and how much he loved me. Every night, I suffered Mustafa's wrath. My other sisters noted Adila's deliberate insensitivity, and scolded her about it, but she carried on regardless. Manu complained to mother that Adila was trying to cause problems between Mustafa and me, but mother dismissed the allegations. Adila was favorite daughter. She was the only person who could do no wrong. Mother blamed the rest of us for fostering sibling rivalry. I deeply resented Adila's mischief-mongering. Her sole aim in life was apparently to make Mustafa angry with me. I became increasingly irritated by his indulgence of her, and told him so. I felt that he gave her too much attention, and that she took advantage of it. Mustafa reveled in the family intrigue. He and Adila shared private jokes and often turned their sarcasm onto me. Mustafa said, "See, Adila, how Tahina is behaving. Why is she jealous of you?" In the midst of this tension, and because of his prohibition against precautions, I learned that I was pregnant once again. Mustafa and I both knew that we had to get away from my family. We did not discuss the matter, but I was very relieved when he arranged for us to move to the Hampstead home of Jam Sadiq Ali, one of Mustafa's political colleagues. He was an important feudal lord from Sindh, who had been one of Bhutto's ministers, and now was in exile like us. We had our own bedroom in this large house, and our host family treated me with affection. Mustafa exhibited a restless attitude. Although I preferred not to, he frequently insisted that we visit my parents. 1. Sunday, during such a visit, Mustafa was doing his yoga exercises on the patio. I walked in, followed by Di Aisha and Nasiba, and saw Adila seated next to him, leering at his body, drinking in the sight of his muscles flexing and relaxing. I snapped impulsively at Mustafa, "If you had to exercise, you should have done it at home. Why are you doing it here?" He turned casually toward Di Aisha, who stood behind me, and said jokingly, "Get hold of her long hair and throw her out." Adila giggled. I could have died of shame, but I found it impossible to react in any sensible manner. Mustafa had turned me into a vegetable. I glanced towards Nasiba, took her from Di Aisha's arms, clung to her, and, sobbing, ran out of the room. My baby was the only person in this lonely world who could give me solace. There was no way out. Mustafa had got me in a corner, and I did not dare defy him. The consequences of the slightest rebellion were too critical. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I handed Nasiba back to Dal. Aisha. Like a sleepwalker, I trudged into my father's bathroom. For a moment, I stared at the medicine cabinet, then I opened it. I examined several bottles. There were tablets from a clinic in Spain, some capsules for high cholesterol, 9 or 10 Valium. I took them all and slipped them inside my clothing. My decision was final. That evening, we left Nasiba and Di with my parents. I waited until we returned to Jam Sadiq's house. Mustafa was involved in a political meeting downstairs, so I went to our bedroom, sat alone and pondered. I thought of Tanya back in Karachi, with Ains. I thought of my beautiful baby Nasiba. I thought of the unborn child in my womb, 4 months along. The images made me hesitate, but only for a moment. The void in my life was too frightening to endure. I felt burdened to the point of extinction by these lives that had come from my own. I opened the bottles and gulped all the contents down. I stood in front of the mirror wondering why I was born in the first place. I remembered Mother's words. Every time she had been upset with me. Why did you not die when you had meningitis? Strange, I thought. That was when Mother was pregnant with Adila. My youngest sister came to life at the moment that I struggled with death. Perhaps I had cheated death. Perhaps I was meant to die then. Now Adila was living and I was dying, once again. I had suggested the name Adila, which means justice. I saw fire engulf me in the mirror. Would death be worse than life? Suicide is a ticket to hell. I moved quickly away, feeling the numbness in my head. No, I decided. Nothing could be worse than life. I staggered into the bedroom and sat alone, staring at the palm of my hand, examining the fate line. The line began to sway and shift. I reeled and slipped to the floor. I watched a wave billow over me, spraying me with peace. They told me that I had been upstairs alone for about half an hour when Mustafa walked in unexpectedly and found me sprawled across the floor. He called out for Jam Sadiq and the two men tried to revive me by splashing cold water on my face. They called a doctor, who summoned an ambulance. Before long, I was in the intensive care ward at Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead. My stomach was pumped, but the toxins had already entered my bloodstream. Mustafa asked the doctor, "Will she live?" "Is she a fighter?" the doctor asked. "Yes, that's our only hope then." From the hospital, Mustafa called my elder sister Rubina, who was visiting from Pakistan. Tahina tried to kill herself, he told her. God only knows why. She's mad. You had better come and, better not. Tell your parents they'll panic. The night passed slowly. I was a fighter, but at the moment I was not interested. What are the dreams that come in this twilight world between life and death? I do not remember them in detail, but they were not sweet. Slowly I began to improve. I saw misty visions of Rubina and Mustafa hovering over me. 2 days passed before doctors agreed to discharge me, along with the news that my pregnancy had been unaffected. The baby seemed more resilient than I wished. I wanted an abortion. I still wanted to die. Mustafa took me to my parents' home to recuperate. I was still groggy and completely disoriented. Mother played the ostrich to perfection, pretending not to know that my wretched life had driven me to suicide. My father avoided the subject. As I slowly surfaced, I saw, looming in front of me, Mustafa's shouldering wrath. My crime, to him, was not against my body, but against his honor. You embarrassed me, he snapped harshly. Do you realize that you were examined by male doctors? Male doctors. You have humiliated me. I shall not forgive you. You will pay for this stupid act. You just wait and see. I was petrified and miserable to have survived. Mother's house was filled with other guests, so she set up a sofa bed in the study. There I returned to a coma-like sleep, with Mustafa at my side. Sometime during the middle of the night, I felt the presence of someone else. My still sedated mind noticed that Mustafa rose from the bed and left the room, but I was too sleepy to pay attention. Much later, I woke once more. Instinctively my hand reached out to feel for Mustafa, but he was not there. I recalled the earlier, dim scene, and wondered where he had gone. I pulled myself from bed and staggered toward the kitchen. Whoever was in there heard me coming, and a shadow fled upstairs. Then Mustafa, half-dressed, came toward me and asked, "Why have you come out?" There was a distinct note of sheepishness in his voice. "I was looking for you," I explained. "Go back to sleep. You shouldn't be walking around in this state." I did as he suggested, too tired to ask any further questions. In the morning, when I was more lucid, I asked Mustafa, "What happened last night?" Someone came into the room. "Who was it?" "Oh, it was Adila," he answered. "Adila?" "Yes, she's involved with an Iranian boy and is having problems. She wanted some advice. She came to discuss it with me." "Yes?" I asked, my confused tone searching for more information. "You were sleeping." "I didn't want to disturb you, so I took her to the breakfast room. You should have spoken to her here. It's not right for you to talk to her, alone in the middle of the night. Suppose my father had come down." Mustafa dismissed my comments and stuck to his story that Adila needed to confide in him like an elder brother. He declared that his advice would keep her from getting hurt. He was now playing the role of savior of the family honor. My only strategy was to get through each day and each endless night. I was mortally afraid of the depths to which I would now have to sink. My greatest fear was that Mustafa would seek to punish me for my suicide attempt by somehow taking Nasiba away from me. I devised strategies to keep her away from him and his temper. Meanwhile, in March 1978, Bhutto was sentenced death. Mustafa intensified his political efforts, joining forces with two of the former Prime Minister's sons, Mir Murtaza Bhutto and Shah Nawaz Bhutto. Mir had been studying at Oxford, but Mustafa convinced him to scrap his education in order to campaign for his father's release. We moved from Jam Sadiq's house to a shabby claustrophobic flat in Hampstead, and Mustafa crowded it by inviting the Bhutto boys to live with us. Condition was so cramped that I left Nasiba and Aish with my family. At times I was even thankful that Tanya was not with me. Immediately Mustafa began to educate the young Met in the art of politics, and sought to raise them as symbols of resistance to the junta. Mir was a novice, but he learned fast. Younger brother Shah Nawaz exhibited the idealistic, faraway gaze of the revolutionary. They established a sort of headquarters of disgruntled Pakistanis in our flat, and plotted Zia's overthrow. The flat was always full of their friends, who kept odd hours and sprawled out wherever they could find room. The two young men related to my background and sensed my predicament. I grew fond of them. Shah Nawaz made a point of chatting to me as I moved from room to room, picking up cups and plates, emptying ashtrays and gathering the laundry to send off to my mother's house. I wondered how they viewed me. I was not a part of their intense debates about the future of our country, or of their fanciful schemes to bring about change. Mustafa introduced Mir to the exiled Husna Sheikh, the woman Bhutto loved. This was somewhat embarrassing for the boy, but he pushed aside his personal considerations, because Husna had valuable contacts, who might save Bhutto's life. I desperately needed to talk to another woman, to gain reassurance that I was not going mad. I found Husna to be the first person in whom I could confide. "Just leave," she advised me, when I told her about Mustafa's constant beatings. "There's no reason why you should take this." Husna planted the seed, but it lay dormant. Mustafa and Mir set off on a mission to persuade various world leaders to pressure the generals to spare Bhutto's life. Mustafa was also certain that these powerful friends would extend financial support to the exile movement. They received campaign funds from Libya's Kunal Gaddafi and from Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nithyan, Sultan of Abu Dhabi. Assad of Syria promised to keep pressure on the Zia regime. Our drawing room was converted into a firing range. Mir set up a target at one end of the room and practiced his marksmanship with an air gun. I was not terribly impressed. He seemed to be just a spirited youngster playing at terror. My concern was for the slugs that peppered the carpet. For his part, Shah Nawaz looked more like a suave terrorist, but his soft eyes gave him away. He did not seem to be able to force a cold look into them. One day Mustafa informed us, in a conspiratorial tone, that Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, had a plan to liberate Bhutto. Palestinian commandos would attack the Rawalpindi Gale, create a diversion and snatch Bhutto from his cell. An aircraft from a friendly country would be waiting at the airport to whisk Bhutto to safety. Mustafa told Mir and Shahnawaz that their father would soon be with us to carry on the fight in exile. Mustafa was livid when he came into our room. Apparently, a call disclosing details of the plan had been put through to Benazir, even though it was known that the telephones were being bugged by various intelligence agencies. Suddenly the Rawalpindi Gale became a fortress, guarded by militant right-wing troops. In the privacy of our bedroom, Mustafa snapped, "How could anybody do such a dumb thing? They have ruined everything by their childishness." Although I continued silently to ache for the absent Tanya, a part of me was glad that she was safe in Karachi with Aints. Increasingly, I had to protect Nasiba from her father. He loved her only up to a point. He cuddled her and played with her, but the moment she became distracted or failed to respond to him, he grew agitated. He could not countenance her tears, so I trained her not to cry. As with Mustafa, I tried to anticipate all her needs so that she would not complain. Like a sprinter consigned to a marathon, I was exhausted by the end of each day. One morning as Mustafa shaved, Nasiba was in the bathroom with him. She splashed about in a bubble bath for a while, until the water was no longer a novelty and the bubbles ceased to fascinate her. The moment I heard her whimper, I rushed in and said, "I'd better take her out. She's tired." "No," Mustafa said calmly. "Leave her there." "But she's tired. You can't take her out." "I have ordered her to stay there." "Ordered? But Mustafa, she's only a year and a half. So what? She'd better learn to obey from this age." I stood there, flustered, helpless and desperate to avert a crisis. Nasiba's wails increased, and Mustafa's anger rose in proportion. I tried to divert my daughter's attention by splashing her with water, but she only cried harder. He told me coolly, "Leave her and go." I was as frantic as he was calm. For a few moments there was a standoff. Mustafa continued to shave, Nasiba kept crying, and I stood at the door, frozen with fear. Suddenly Mustafa turned towards Nasiba with menace in his eyes. She screamed, looking at him with her big, frightened eyes. He grabbed her and pushed her head under the water. I ran to them and begged him to let go, but he shoved me aside and held her under, with an expression on his face that said he was determined to teach us a lesson. My mind flashed through horrific alternatives. My baby was drowning. But if I struggled with him, I would only increase his anger. I pleaded with him, but he would not relent. An eternity passed before me. Then, when Nasiba's struggles finally diminished, he released his grip. I pulled my baby out of the water. She coughed and spluttered. Her eyes bulged with fear. I shot a sharp glance at Mustafa, but the look in his eyes was so evil that I could only clutch Nasiba and run out. Nasiba was afraid of water from that moment on. Bath time was an ordeal, a punishment. Water and screaming went together, and I made sure that I bathed her. When her father was absent, I was afraid to let Mustafa take her out on his own. An innocent walk in the park might turn into an excursion to hell. I dreamed of release, but reality stood in front of me like a stone wall. Divorce was just not possible. British and Pakistani law might be on my side, but in the feudal world, a man retains control of his daughter, and I knew that Mustafa would use her as a hostage to assure my loyalty. I was willing to forsake everything except Nasiba. I began to hope secretly that Mustafa would die, but I buried these thoughts quickly and deeply, terrified that he would somehow discover them. Apricina ultimately settles into a monotonous routine. Anger recedes. Senses dull. The spirit is crushed. It was increasingly apparent that money was pouring in from various sources to support the cause. Later on, Kabul and Syria would also help them. The Bhutto boys, who a short time earlier were more or less normal young men enjoying the casual benefits of Western society, were now transformed into well-financed revolutionaries. Mustafa benefited, too. A courier arrived from Aga Hassan Obdi of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, delivering a briefcase containing £50,000. Mustafa asked Meto deposit the cash in my mother's safe. The newfound status as politicians inspired Mir's confidence, and he very quickly challenged the power and authority of his teacher. He was, after all, a Bhutto, and the surname worked magic. It became unnecessary to share anything with Mustafa. Husna fed this. She warned Mir that his father had never completely trusted Mustafa, and advised him to strike out on his own. Both brothers moved out of our flat and into a suite. The young Bhutto's revolution went jet-set. Tailored suits replaced blue jeans. The self-conscious demeanor of the young student gave way to swagger. Women and other accessories of the fast lane were now available to them. While their adventurous lifestyle of subterfuge, intrigue and high risk had proved irresistibly romantic to other young men of their age, now they were increasingly seen in the company of mink-clad ladies. One of Mir's long-standing companions was the glamorous and much older wife of a Mediterranean politician. To me, the Bhutto boys seemed like mixtures of Che Guevara and characters that had stepped out of a Harold Robbins novel. Although the relationship was growing strained, Mustafa continued to work with the boys. They decided that the People's Party needed to demonstrate to the world that it stood by its imprisoned leader, and called for a rally in front of the Pakistan embassy in Lone Square. In Pakistan, this would have been an open invitation to slaughter, but in the UK it could be civilized protest. The question was, would the expatriate masses turn out? They came in spontaneous waves, from all over Europe, carrying homemade banners and placards. The legend Save Bhutto was emblazoned on their t-shirts. They gathered solemnly at Speaker's Corner and marched off to save their leader from the hangman's noose. The serpentine procession snaked its way from Park Lane and assembled in front of the embassy. Mustafa, Mir and others gave fiery speeches. We could only hope that the international news coverage would pressure Zia into sparing Bhutto's life. We moved to a little cottage in Arklay Lane in Barnet, very close to my parents' home. Compared with the flat, it was an improvement. Yet it irked me to be the mistress of a home that was decorated so distastefully. I tried to improve it, but the cheap reproduction French furniture stuck out hideously, no matter what I did to hide it. Nylon carpets made it all worse. I felt terribly disoriented in this new environment. As I waited out my pregnancy, the political intrigue deepened. Bhutto's nephew, Tariq Islam, visited his uncle in prison and related the event to us in England. He said that his uncle weighed only 6 and a hailstone. His hands and feet were swollen. His chronic gum ailment had been exacerbated by neglect. Stomach cramps left him in a permanent state of agony. Even so, Tariq said, his uncle was mentally alert and eager to discuss politics. He wanted to know about developments both in Pakistan and abroad. He was pleased to hear that his sons had become active in politics and were campaigning to save his life. He asked about Mustafa, too, wanting to know if his protege was a good orator. When Tariq said yes, Bhutto declared with a wry smile, not better than me. As the conversation continued, Bhutto grew more confused and depressed. He could not understand why the people had not stormed the prison gates to free him. Where was the spontaneous uprising that would sweep away the dictator? Tariq requested that Bhutto give him a message to carry to the People's Party leaders that would revitalize the party. Do they want me to spoon-feed them? Bhutto replied. Don't they know what they have to do? All the Bhutto Brothers International campaign came to naught. Zia made sure that Bhutto died many times already dead when the body was hanged. During his time in prison, he was constantly humiliated and insulted. The proud former Prime Minister was forced to use a noxious, open toilet in the presence of a guard. A brigadier was placed in the opposite cell expressly to provoke him to a frenzy. The brigadier knew the pressure points. He used the most foul language to debase Bhutto's mother, mocking and taunting until the former Prime Minister would lose his composure. On the 3rd of April 1979, Benazir was taken to see her father and informed that it would be the last visit. She was dismayed to find herself separated from him by iron bars and a large table, but when she pleaded with the guards to allow her to embrace him, he admonished, "Don't ever beg them for anything." She had brought him his favorite perfume, Shalimar, and some books. He accepted the perfume, but refused the books with a wry smile, explaining, "I don't think I'll have time to finish these." She handed him a razor, and he said, "Good, I'll shave this beard off. I do not want to die like a bloody mullah." Here, accounts merge fact and fiction. What actually happened may never be known. It is said that the brigadier, Bhutto's tormentor, walked into the cell at about 1 o'clock in the morning following Benazir's visit. He handed Bhutto sheets of paper and a pen, and demanded his confession. Bhutto started to write. His mind must have been clogged with memories, the triumphs, the adulation of adoring crowds. Where had it all fled? Here he was, terrifyingly alone, with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He knew that the proper words of compromise might save him. But, on a sudden impulse, he tore up the paper and flung away his life. The brigadier rose and kicked Bhutto in the stomach. Some say that Bhutto was beaten unconscious, but that he regained his senses as he was carried off to the gallows, that he staggered, fell, stood up and walked the final steps with dignity and defiance. Others say that he was already dead when the body was hanged. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. The People's Party and Pakistan had a martyr. I was in the last stages of pregnancy. Father was away on business in Japan and Manu was at home on holiday from school when Mustafa and I went to visit. Adila was dressed as if she were ready to go to a dinner party. She wore a crepe de chine shirt and trousers, draped with a stylish chiffon veil. Her face was fully made up. She paid special attention to Mustafa, leaning forward, drinking in his every word. Mother interrupted the conversation at one point and instructed, "Adila, make some coffee." My younger sister pouted. "I'm not feeling well," she complained. "Zarmina should make it." With a sigh, Zarmina went off to the kitchen. Adila resumed her worshipful pose. She expressed great interest in Mustafa's assessment of the current political situation in Pakistan and leaned forward, expectantly, awaiting more. She did not appear ill. Suddenly, in a tone that allowed no argument, Manu snapped, "Adila, get up and leave the room." Adila was shocked, but complied. I was curious to know why Manu objected so sharply to Adila's presence in the room, and after we had returned to our own home, I called her and asked. Manu was very agitated. She told me that she had seen Mustafa pick up Adila from school and drive off with her. She did not know where they went, but they were gone for 3 hours. I felt my body freeze. Manu explained, "When you and Mustafa entered today, I kept looking at Adila. I wanted to see her reaction. She had dressed up only after she was told you were coming. Her whole being responded to him. The way she was sitting, the glances they exchanged, were telltale. I could not tolerate it. I had to tell her to leave the room. There is a limit to such blatant flirtation. I am surprised no one else in this family noticed. I was certain that Mustafa had. I had it out with her after you left, Manu reported. I gave her hell. Mummy and Zarmina were there, too. This sort of behavior is just not acceptable. Who does she think she is? After I hung up the phone, I stood paralyzed for a few moments. Then I went to Mustafa and confronted him. He stared straight into my eyes and denied the whole story. It's pure nonsense, he contended. I never picked her up from anywhere. I was not convinced, but I had no way of discovering the truth. Mustafa was quick to implement the proper defense. He suggested that Manu still resented him, due to their first encounter. Once again, he undercut my moorings. Isolate the enemy and then crush him. I did not know who or what to believe. Was Manu doing this because she harbored ill will for Mustafa? Was she upset because of Mustafa's obvious preference for the baby of the family? Were all my sisters attempting to win his affections, to become the favored sister-in-law? The following morning I received a frantic phone call from Mother. Adila had run away from home and no one knew where she was. It's all Manu's fault, Mother snapped. Adila was accused of all sorts of terrible things. She is obviously very hurt. Manu implied that something was going on between Mustafa and Adi. Mother was characteristically more terrified by the prospect of a developing scandal than by the reality of the matter. She was determined to keep this entire episode under wraps, so she now turned to the villain for help. Mustafa was supposed to travel to Liverpool that day for a political meeting, but he agreed to cancel his trip to help us locate Adila. He left to search London, as I headed for Mother's house. Throughout the morning Manu phoned Adila's friends, trying to track our runaway sister. Mother feared the worst, but she tried desperately to conceal her hysteria behind a calm exterior. She paced about, gulping coffee. Mustafa called during the afternoon to report no success. Mother broke down on the phone and begged him not to give up the search. Mustafa offered reassurance. He was coming over to discuss a plan. When he arrived, he disclosed that his plan was to tap Mother's phone, as well as ours. As this sort of thing goes on in Pakistan all the time, we accepted what he said. He was positive that Adila would attempt to contact someone in the family, and, when she did so, we'll be able to trace her. He explained, I've spoken to the appropriate authorities. They've agreed to help us find her. Mustafa and I left for our own home, along with Dia Aisha and Nasiba. On the way Mustafa stopped to buy 2 bottles of wine. How could you think of wine at this time? I asked, everything is in such a mess. When will you find time to sip this wine? He mumbled a confused reply, something about us having run out of stock. He dropped me off at the house with instructions to sit by the phone, then went off to continue the search. It was 10 p.m. when Adila called, sounding very hurt. She vowed, I'm never going back to that house. They all hate me. They have accused me of having designs on Mustafa. Mustafa is like my brother. Even you don't trust me. I'm not going home, ever. I'll call later. The telephone clicked dead. I immediately called my mother and reported the conversation. When Adila called back about an hour later, I insisted that I had to see her, and reminded her that father would be furious if and when he found out about her latest episode. She relented and said, come and see me at the Hilton Hotel, in the lobby. Before I had a chance to leave, Mustafa called and I reported this latest development. Why don't you come there and handle her? I suggested. We have to get her to return. He agreed to meet me at the Hilton. With Dal, Aisha and Nasiba in tow, I rushed over in a taxi. Dressed in a kaftan that doubled as a maternity gown, I walked into the hotel only a few moments before Mustafa appeared. As Adila made a grand entrance into the lobby, I noticed that Najib, who had spent a lot of time with us at the Hampstead flat and was a close friend of Mir Bhutto, also happened to be there. He remained in the shadows. We sat at a table in the lobby and spoke in hushed tones. I tried to reason with Adila, but when I saw that she remained obstinate, I tired of her shenanigans and told Mustafa to pick her up and drag her to the car. If she were your daughter, you would have killed her by now. You wouldn't sit around a table negotiating her return. Don't you remember Manu? I asked. Just put her into the car. She doesn't have a choice. Adila was adamant that she would not go home. I'm in love with an Iranian boy, she announced with a pout. I'm going to stay with him. You can't stop me. I stared daggers at her, waiting for Mustafa to assume the role of a protective and domineering brother-in-law, as he had done with Manu. But I was astonished to hear him suggest, listen, I think that we should send her to him with Dai Aisha as a chaperone. It was an incredible proposition, and completely out of character with Mustafa's feudal standards. I was disgusted. How can you even suggest such a thing? I asked. Adila has to go home. There's no other way. Adila's manner grew more aggressive. We raised our voices, and I heightened the emotion by pulling at Adila, trying to get her out of her chair to move her towards the door. She struggled against me, and ripped my kaftan at the neck. At first Mustafa was a passive spectator to our wrestling match. But then, in an apparent attempt to avoid a scene in this five-star hotel, he hammered out a compromise. If Adila would not come with us, and if I would not leave her on her own, we would all have to stay here together for the night, until we could sort out our disagreements. Najib suddenly emerged from the sidelines and stood next to Mustafa at the front desk as he booked a room. I found this strange, but could not decipher why. I shook my head as if to shake off the confusion, located a phone, and informed our mother of the plan. Adila stood by my side, making sure that I did not disclose where we're. That night, Adila and I shared a bed with Nasiba. Mustafa and Dai Aisha slept on the floor. Very early in the morning, Mother and Manu barged in. Mustafa jumped up in surprise and offered a quick excuse to leave on his delayed trip to Liverpool. I thought he looked very sheepish as he walked out of the door, but I turned my attention to the tense family crisis. Mother angrily explained that she and Manu had played sleuth all night, calling the security officers at every hotel in London, complaining of an underage runaway. They had finally discovered that this particular room had been booked the previous morning by Najib, in the fictitious name of Samina Khan. Pieces of the puzzle suddenly came together. Images flashed through my mind. Had Mustafa and Adila spent the day here together? Was he with her when she called me? Were they laughing at us? I shot an involuntary glance at the bed where I had slept all night. Had they been there? On those same sheets? I felt sick. Still, my vegetable brain refused to acknowledge what was now so clear. Adila told us that she had met up with the Bhutto brothers, who were friends of the Iranian boy. She claimed that she had spent the entire day with them. Manu had doubts, but both Mother and I used Adila's explanation as sand in which to bury our heads. Each of us maintained our personal charade. Adila insisted on coming home with me. When Mother refused to let her, she snapped, "Why can't I stay with Tahina? If I can spend nights with Rubina, I can spend nights with Tahina." I'm not going home. I want to stay with Tahina. You will not let us get close to her. You hate her for some reason. Mother gave up arguing, due to mental exhaustion, but her permission was temporary. She ordered Adila to leave my house and come home the very moment that Mustafa returned from Liverpool. I desperately wanted to talk to Adila that day, but as soon as we walked into my house, she gobbled several sleeping pills and went to sleep. She woke only when Mustafa arrived. I reminded her that she was under Mother's order to leave now, but she was freshly defiant. Mustafa told me that Adila wanted to speak to him privately. I think I have to sort her out, he said. I have to put some sense in her head. So if you could leave us alone for a while, we could talk. I don't see why she can't talk in front of me, I responded. She's my sister. What's she afraid of? She doesn't trust any of you. You'll tell your mother about her problems. She needs to talk to someone she can trust. I gave in, as he knew that I would. I did not want to believe that I was being betrayed. I was confused. For too long now, Mustafa had pulled all my strings, like a puppet master, and now those strings were hopelessly, perhaps permanently, entangled. That evening, Mustafa had to contend once more with my mother and Manu. They arrived unexpectedly and marched into the house. Mother, appearing broken but severe and resolute, was armed with the Quran. She commanded, Adila, get into the car. Adila began to object, but Mother silenced her with a sharp slap in the face. Then she turned to Mustafa and said, I am carrying the holy book in my hand. In its name, get out of our lives. You're a cunning and evil man. You're destructive. I warn you not to play with our family's honor. I want you to send my daughter home immediately. I won't let her remain in your house. What do you know? Mustafa retorted. He took Mother by the arm and guided her into the living room. He tried adopting a more reasonable tone. I have saved this family's honor, he claimed. But I had rather not talk about it. Manu interrupted and rudely accused Mustafa of corrupting the morals of a minor. Don't make up stories to cover up the truth, she warned. My response was that of a conditioned zombie, who could neither discern the whole truth of the matter nor deal with it. I was a dutiful wife, only conscious that it was my role to defend Mustafa. I ordered Manu out of my house, because she was insulting my husband. Mother dragged Adila to her car, and they drove off. I needed to hear the truth from Mustafa, and I reasoned with him to clear my doubts. I told him that if I was to defend him to my family, I needed to know the facts. Mustafa read from a new script. Manu was right. He said I did pick Adila up from school that day. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was doing with her, so I denied the story. Adila was pregnant. It was that Iranian boy. I had taken her to a clinic for an abortions. I was protecting your family's honor. For this I am being painted as a dishonorable man. It's a strange world when you're condemned for your kindness. I wanted desperately to believe my husband, and so I did. Armed with this fresh evidence of his innocence, I went to see my mother. She demanded proof, the receipt for the abortion. Mustafa did not have it. Mother wanted to know where the abortion was performed. Mustafa would not tell. At this point Mother decided that she would have no more to do with Mustafa and me. This was not a workable relationship. I discussed my mental anguish with my obstetrician. She was a Welsh woman who was very sympathetic to my plight. Her face reacted with revulsion when I told her how Mustafa beat me. He's very violent, I said. I'm miserable with him. I asked for tranquilizers, and she wrote a prescription for Valium, assuring me that it would not endanger my child. My father had prepaid the childbirth costs prior to our current estrangement, So on the 27th of December 1979, when I went into labor, Mustafa drove me to a small, exclusive clinic in the Hampstead area. His expression carried a sense of mild rebuke. He considered these facilities to be excessive for mere childbirth. My obstetrician greeted me warmly, but was cool to Mustafa. I missed my family intensely, once again cut off from them when I needed them most. Apart from the physical pangs of childbirth, I was racked with guilt. I was tortured by the prospect that my baby might not be normal, owing to my suicide attempt. Throughout my labor, I prayed to God to forgive my selfishness and spare my baby from punishment. My heart pounded with fear as I strained for the first look at my new daughter Nisha. Instantly my anxiety evaporated and was replaced by unconditional love. I removed the locket from my neck inscribed with the name of Allah and placed it around hers to protect her from the evil eye. 2 hours after my daughter's birth, Mustafa came into my private room and sat by my bed. I could see that he was tense and angry. He was in the mood that I most feared, yet I could not restrain myself from pouring out my own frustrations. I wondered, even if my suspicions concerning him and Adila are not true, how could a man of Mustafa's intellect allow this mess to take over our lives? One of the reasons I had married him was to elevate myself in my mother's eyes, but all I had found was additional humiliation and pain. Now, I realized, I had been allowed a safe moment to vent my rage. He would not dare strike me here in such a public place, at such a time. I complained, Mustafa, you've messed up everything. Here I am in a hospital, all alone. You have created havoc by your connivance and intrigue. You're like an old, petty village woman who thrives on carrying tales and keeping families apart. He listened to this tirade with mounting fury. I saw the rage growing, but I could not stop. You have cut me off from my family. I accused. I have 4 sisters. I have a brother. Parents. Where are they? Why aren't they with me today? Think about it. Who's responsible? Think. Mustafa rose from his chair and slapped me hard, 2 hours after I had delivered his child. With methodical movements, he lashed his hand across my face, back and forth. Then he resorted to his favorite tactic, twisting my forearm until I thought the limb would crack in two. I bit fiercely into my lip to avoid crying out. He left me, bruised and battered, in my hospital bed, and went to the airport to meet his 13-year-old son Bilal, who was flying in from Pakistan to live with us. My obstetrician found me alone in my room, weeping. Why should I be so devastated at such a joyous moment? She knew, and she listened quietly as I sobbed out the details. Then she advised softly, "Nobody can help you unless you help yourself." I knew that she was right. Why did I not cry out as he beat me? Why did I not attract the doctors and nurses and demand that someone call the police? What could they do? What could the police do? They would admonish Mustafa, but sooner or later I would be alone with him, in a worse predicament than before. My silence was not to protect Mustafa, it was to protect myself. My father did not call to see me or the baby, but he sent me a locket with a prayer inscribed on it. I was touched by the gesture, which told me that he had access to me through his prayers. I needed them. My obstetrician helped me in the only way she could, by finding purported medical reasons to keep me in the clinic for a few extra days. When finally it was time to leave, Mustafa arrived with a present for me, a very expensive white cashmere coat. Quite obviously, this was supposed to be compensation. With the execution of Bhutto in April 1979, a portion of the exiled community rallied around his sons and distanced themselves from Mustafa. Adventurism was in the air. The would-be terrorists had outgrown their air guns, and by 1981, were shopping for the real thing. The revolutionary group known as ul-Zulfikar, aka the Pakistan Liberation Army, was born. The Bhutto brothers and their supporters compiled hit lists, planning to assassinate the key figures of the Zia regime, leaving a power vacuum that they could fill. They moved to Afghanistan and set up a secret training camp in Kabul. The Americans were supporting Zia against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The constitution had been violated by the man they supported. The young Bhutto boy's father had been murdered by hanging. Their mother and sister were confined. They had no option but to take up armed struggle with the help of those few countries which were prepared to guide them and provide shelter. Mustafa was not privy to the plot, but he learned a few of the details, and he argued the futility of attempting to dislodge the generals forcibly. He understood the impatience of the Bhutto boys, but he could not condone their plans. Pakistanis are repelled by acts of sabotage and assassination. Mustafa knew that ul-Zulfikar would attract not only hardcore activists, but infiltrators from the world's intelligence services. He worried that ul-Zulfikar would give Zia the pretext for a witch hunt to eliminate any trace of People's Party support. Terror was certain to be met with terror, and the innocent would suffer torture, imprisonment, and the gallows. In sum, he was convinced that this outlaw army would tarnish the image of the entire party, and would only slow down the peaceful struggle for the restoration of democracy. Mustafa favored a more prosaic style of politics. He traveled across the country and the continent, addressing large public meetings, stirring sagging spirits, rebuilding the party, always with me in tow. He became the tireless cheerleader, arguing for sensible change. Old friends and colleagues dropped in constantly, and the subject was always politics. I enjoyed their conversations, and slowly realized that, whatever the horror of my private life, I could find reason for existence in working for the liberation and betterment of my homeland. On the 18th of February 1980, my 27th birthday, my father telephoned to extend the family's forgiving hand. 3 months of estrangement had passed. No one in my family had seen Nisha. Father asked what I wanted for my birthday, and I answered, to see you. He replied in a choked voice, "Come tonight." Mustafa happily agreed. That evening, as we climbed the stairs to the upper section of the house, we encountered Adila, coming down. Mustafa had no choice but to ignore her and follow me up, to me. It signaled my ascent and her descent. Stuttering a little at first, family life began again, and gradually became more coherent. But it seemed that each step closer to my family took me further from my husband. Mustafa's obsessions took perverse forms. Whenever he saw me laughing or joking with my parents, his mood darkened, and I knew that the next moment we were alone he would find a pretext for an argument that would lead to violence. A spiral of allegations began as soon as we returned home night and continued until daylight seeped through the curtains. He picked up my own words and hurled them back at me until I lost the thread of logic. He underscored intermittent points with his fists, or his shoes inevitably. I apologized for whatever supposed outrages I had committed. "Are you really sorry?" he would goad. "Yes." "Are you sincerely sorry?" "Yes, yes." "Your tone is wrong. You don't sound as if you're sorry." This was as it had been during my childhood years, when I obeyed mother, but did not look obedient. I replied, "Mustafa, I'm exhausted. Please believe me. I'm sorry. But you don't really feel that you did something wrong." "But I do. I do. 2 hours ago, you were explaining your position. You were defending yourself. I thought. You thought you could justify your actions. Do you still think?" "No. You have. proved that I was wrong to think. Our relationship had become one long argument. These nocturnal verbal skirmishes were almost the only way in which Mustafa communicated with me. He had a repertoire of abuses so vile that they would make a whore blush. He could shred me to ribbons with his tongue. I bore the sole responsibility of camouflaging our relationship from others. Mustafa was extraordinarily clever. He had the facility to point all blame at me, and if others were to learn of my humiliation, it would be turned around to reflect badly only on me. In Mustafa's male-dominated society, he would always emerge smelling like roses. Despite the bitterness that pervaded our lives, we continued to act the gracious host and hostess as we entertained friends and political contacts. Media men, powerful politicians, and old acquaintances from abroad constantly arrived on our doorstep. In preparation for our dinners, Mustafa played the role of the great chef as Dai Aisha, and I served as his menials. Mustafa conjured gastronomic fantasies. Dai chopped and peeled. I cleaned up the mess. Mustafa had a fit if we altered his instructions in the tiniest detail, or if we were too slow, or if I had failed to anticipate any item that he might require. The proximity of huge, sharp-honed knives added a chilling dimension to these cooking sessions.